Shall I try that? There we go. All right, so I had already started, but I'm not going to say that all again. So basically, I trained as a classicist, studied classics at Oxford, and then I did an art foundation and pursued art for a bit. I kind of went back to classics, trained to be a classics teacher. 2020, stopped doing that, and now full-time painting again. So this is my this is a view of my studio currently, not in my studio today, obviously, and some things I've been experimenting with, but it probably makes more sense to kind of start a bit more from the beginning. So this is, I think, one of the first paintings I did on my art foundation course following my degree. And I was very much influenced by Gerhard Richter, so using photos as reference for paintings. But for this particular painting, I used a number of photographs, so I re-photographed a photograph, which I think was something that Richter did, and I photographed it in different sort of stages of, to different degrees of being in focus or not. So the idea was that round the eye was the most in focus, and then going out from that was kind of getting more and more blurred. So I was really just exploring the properties of the paint, and I suppose verisimilitude, how much can I get it looking like a photograph, while at the same time, I suppose here, not really exploring the qualities of paint as such, but more a kind of photorealism. Towards the end of the course, I sort of came back to my classical background, exploring classicism in painting, and I was looking at the figure of Daphne. Daphne is from Greek mythology. She was a nymph who was chased by the god Apollo, and she prayed to her father to get her out of this awkward situation where she was basically about to be raped. And she prayed to her father, who was a river god, and he turned her into a tree. So I suppose already at Art Foundation, I was engaging with feminism and what that meant, both through a kind of ancient lens and modern lens. But still very much kind of quite photorealist, but also quite surrealist in its look. Incidentally, I have never since put words on a painting. You can see there are some words at the bottom. It was a quote from a poem by Anne Carson, I think, about Daphne. But I think it was probably because I was coming straight from a very literary degree, and I was still quite steeped in words, and using those partly to communicate as well as visuals. So I continued on, I think this was just after the foundation course, to explore photos, digital photos, and translating them into paint. So I was looking at people like Dan Hayes, also still very much at Gerhard Richter. About a year later, I guess, I was still looking at photos, but I became frustrated with kind of just translating what I was seeing in the photo or the film. And so I I sort of, within this painting, I came up with this, what I thought was a sort of quite new way of notating the ephemerality of a photo or a piece of film, by kind of blocking in the image and then having these long vertical lines just going across the whole painting, defining within it kind of different layers and basically optical mixing. So yeah, so this was the first painting of its kind, and I would go on to use these lines fairly extensively in my practice after that. So this was actually taken from a found image of Winona Ryder in the film Aliens. Then what I did next was I actually played the film of Aliens on a fairly old television, and took photos of the screen as the film was playing, and came up with these what I saw as very beautiful grainy images, which I could then kind of draw this stylized picture of it out of it, using the vertical lines. And the original photos that I worked from were these, and as you can see, they're quite highly coloured, quite high key colours. And this is what happens when you photograph a television. You get a lot of contrast, so lots of tonal contrast, and also lots of very high key colour. But what I wanted to do was really tone it all down, and so I made all the hues much closer together, all the tones much closer together, having this sort of desaturated image. And I think that was, I mean, I guess it's fairly obvious, but very much inspired by post-impressionism, people like Gwen John, but also into the 21st century with people like Luke Toymans. I'd gone on a trip to Amsterdam and was really struck by how some of the Amsterdam painters were painting light, and the very subtle modulations of light. And of course, as I was looking at these images from the television screen emits light. And so the way I was kind of mixing these very close colours was an exploration of how to communicate this. The idea was, when you see these paintings in the flesh, when you actually move past it, you get a movement. There's a kind of vibration that I really liked. And I think Monet actually talked about this sort of vibration that you get when you put down pure colours, I suppose, and then when you stand back, they mix themselves. So I don't think I put a quote in, but basically the title of this whole series was called Count Zero, based on the sci-fi novel by William Gibson called Count Zero. The quote on the back of the book says, "On receiving an interrupt, reset the counter to zero." So conceptually, it's kind of articulating ideas about the interface between analog and digital. So I'm using an analog technique of brush on canvas to articulate something which is quite digital, and also it was pretty sci-fi, I suppose, because for me these paintings were crystallizing a kind of ghost in the machine. You know, they're very cropped close-ups. It could be anybody's face, even though it's Winona Ryder's face. But in the whole series, I was wanting to explore, I think it was about 1.5 minutes of the film, but I just obviously slowed it down by looking at all these minute differences of expression. So the strand that really goes through my work is a fascination with people, with people's faces, with texture, with layers. So this was me exploring collage with paint as well, and painting on different surfaces. Here I was painting on polyester. And this piece was selected along with another piece, I think, for the Indiscerning Eye in about 2005 by the man who used to run the art collection of the Barings Bank. And he actually still collects my work now, so that's very nice. So I continue to work from film. This is also based on a photo taken of a film playing on television. The film was Jerry by Gus Van Sant, starring on the left Matt Damon and on the right Casey Affleck. So this was a much looser exploration of the painting technique I developed. There was a bit of a break. Children were involved, and then I came back to painting. I think this must have been 2017, 2016, working from another film, which was Gattaca, starring Uma Thurman. And this set of 4 little paintings were, I set out very much to kind of create a series of paintings. Again, I guess like the Count Zero paintings. But these ones turned out a lot brighter. I decided to move away from the very desaturated colours because I felt they weren't really appealing enough. And so these were designed to be more appealing in a way, but also I was just enjoying the colour rather than trying to tone it all down all the time. So very much inspired by people like Bouillard, again Monet, and Walter Sickert as well, in terms of the colours I was using, the way I was using layers, brightly coloured underpainting, brightly coloured ground, and then more tertiary colours on top. So there was a little bit of a break again, and then in 2020 I came back to the same set of photographs that I'd worked on from Gattaca, but this time I rephotographed them again. So the original photos were photos taken of the television screen with the film playing, and then the second set of photographs were photos of the digital images of these on the screen. And what happened was something I hadn't planned for at all, which was the moire effect. And this happens when you've got grids of lines, and what you get on a cathode ray TV, of course, is you do get grids of a grid of lights, and then they change different colours according to the picture on the screen. But the fact that there were grids, and then I was taking a photograph of that grid at a slight angle, meant that the grids were crossing, and so you get these curved lines forming. Unfortunately, I haven't got the version of this PowerPoint where I put in a photo of the photo I use for reference, so you can see what I'm talking about, but hopefully you understand what I mean. So these lines were, yeah, it's a glitch effect, I suppose, due to the way physics works, the way light works. And again, with this series, I was using very bright underpainting, painting the more tertiary colours on top, and using the vertical lines. I think I did a Turps online surgery. This must have been before the Turps course. And the suggestion that came out of that was to actually redo the original paintings and explore different dimensions, maybe different colour sets, which I did. And that was interesting, seeing the effect of just changing dimensions. In the painting on the left, it was a sort of head to knee portrait, perhaps seeming a little bit too cropped, whereas the one that I was working on at the time on the right, I extended that into an elongated shape, which seemed to suggest more of a mirror. So the perhaps suggesting ideas of identity and perception a little bit more, which was more resonant for what I was trying to achieve. This was also from a second set of paintings, so paintings from paintings. So partly inspired and prompted by the Turps online surgery to look at Francis Alice's series of paintings called Fabiola, where he painted the same woman over and over again, literally hundreds of paintings. And although I have not kept them as the same as he did, if you see what I mean, it was interesting painting from a painting and seeing what happened. So for example, with this painting, the colours went very fiery, whereas the original was much more of a mix of colours. And this one I've actually got the title wrong. It's called The Geography of Her Gaze. So all of these paintings were shown in a solo show at Stamford Contemporary Arts. Wasn't the best space, as you can see, because of the metal poles that everything had to be hung on. But it was nice to see everything together, you know, the whole series together, which I'd made basically in the first lockdown, alongside my teaching, which was happening online, and I didn't have to commute, so I had a lot more time to paint, which was amazing. This series marks the beginning of my Arts Council funded project. I got funding last May to start a project exploring my own experience of postnatal psychosis. So this is a fairly rare condition, I guess, that affects women after they give birth. It's not depression, as many people might think, but it's a form of psychosis, so where you lose touch with reality. And I became ill with this 3 times after the birth of my children. So, and I'd never really made work about it, and I'd often thought it would be a good thing to do. So I looked at images of mad women, in particular Ophelia, using a different model, a found model from some footage from a TV series I'd watched. And I was just, in these 3 paintings, I was really exploring using different grounds. And I wanted to see what would happen if I used a yellow ground. And the yellow was a deliberate choice because of the association with madness. You've got painters like Van Gogh, who used, I think in his room at Arles, there's a lot of yellow in that painting. A lot has been written about his use of yellow, but also the Charlotte Perkins Gilman story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is about a woman in the 20th century, I think, who suffered from postnatal psychosis, and her experience of it, notably the wallpaper sort of coming to life. Right. Okay, so this was the first of some bigger paintings I made as part of my Arts Council funding project. At this point, I was artist in residence at Leicester Contemporary, which is a temporary space. They've got it for a year, rent-free, in the centre of Leicester. Leicester was quite badly affected by COVID, and I think what happened with these paintings was I was still exploring the postnatal psychosis, but I was seeing the derelict city centre around me as something of a metaphor for a derelict mental state, if you like. And so paintings like this explore how there is dereliction, there is trauma, and there is pain, but there is also escape, a sense of escape you get when you're psychotic. You feel great awe and wonder at many things that other people don't. And you do feel a sense of excitement that you will probably never feel again. So I was trying to sort of see both sides of it and somehow express that in paint. Although in a lot of ways, I think the most interesting thing about this painting art is the more abstract elements. So I was pushing the theme further, really, exploring ideas of pain, still using film as reference material. This painting is very much about illness, female suffering, male indifference, and it was a bit of a breakthrough for me because I was being a lot more expressive. The painting started off being very controlled and methodical, and then, as you can probably see, there's another layer on top where I've worked on top of it and added washes and just been a bit more expressive, really. So this was just before the Turps Correspondence Course started. I think I put this in for my first review. So this is also part of my residency work. Oops. So once again, working with film imagery, but more influenced here, I think, by Luke Toyman's, and literally putting the viewer in the position of a person ill in bed. This was done during COVID, so I think I was thinking of ill people, basically, and their experience. But the chorus is a reference to If you've ever been in hospital, you might get to the point where you're there ill in bed and you're just surrounded by not one, but about 6 doctors who are talking about you. And they seem to be like a kind of Greek chorus, telling you about what's happened to you in this very elevated language. So once again, my classical background coming through. This again was Turps course, but after my first review, responding to the idea from my mentor that I needed to put more space into the paintings, although I'm not sure if I really achieved it. But I quite liked the idea of having these largish areas of quite indistinct space. You couldn't tell what it was, whether it was solid or abstract or something else. And really I was going back to an influence on me from quite a number of years ago, which was Peter Doig. This painting actually takes some passages from some of his cabin paintings, so it quite literally quotes some aspects of that. At the same time as making that, I was making paintings like this, which are a lot more controlled and methodical. Sometimes it feels like my painting is quite changeable, and there'll be quite a different style between different paintings. This is actually on linen. I put that down wrong. And I was really enjoying the way that the linen texture was coming through the painting in parts, and then other parts of the painting were more thickly painted. And it's long been an ambition of mine to have different kinds of mark making across one single painting. So this is fairly recent. This is probably the most recent work, coming up to the most recent work now, and this is exploring a different kind of home photo technique, which was inspired by the work of Abby Shug. She works with computer generated models, and I don't, but one thing that she does is she has a digital photo on a screen, and then she will tilt the screen and take a photo of that, and you get this graying, which is a kind of solarization. And solarization as a technique actually goes back to very early photography. Photographers like Dora Maar, Man Ray, people like that. And so I'm really exploring the disintegration of the photographic image and what happens when you put that into paint, and how the painterly marks can sort of add to that and overlap with that as well. So again, this is looking at solarization, exploring ways of making the paintings less recognizable. What happens when you make them less recognizable? They're harder to process, they slow down looking, and that's something that I'm aiming for, so that the images are not so kind of instantaneous and recognizable. I want them to be a lot harder to process, a lot harder to digest, so that you want to come back to them. This is the most recent one, I think. Looking at a classical sculpture, exploring ideas of light and dark. Solarization reverses light and dark. The female Janus figure here looks forward and backwards, both into the new year and back into the old year. So there's a kind of a sense of a yin and yang of opposites, questioning, having sort of two different personalities, maybe in one personality, and also the idea of what is the feminine, I suppose. And we've got this iconic classical sculpture, but is that it? Okay, I'm just going to go back to the beginning, just say something briefly about what's going on currently in the studio. So for quite a while, I've been fascinated by the work of a US painter called Joshua Hagler, and he works very much in layers. His work is actually quite abstract, but for a long time I've wanted to try out some of his techniques, so I'm just kind of starting out on this, working with what I saw as quite a failed painting that didn't really work out, and working over it. So I was looking at images of female boxers, and I'm going to work on top of this using masks to mask off certain areas, peel off the paint in places, and then kind of excavate into the layers a little bit. I don't know if it will go anywhere, but just want to have play, really. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. Does anyone have any questions or anything they'd like to say?
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
I particularly found interesting, I Became a Spider and the Doig influenced work. I like the spatial elements of those, and the environments. There's feelings of Edvard Munch for me, not the obvious scream, but certainly is other images of figures within an environment. And Marlene Dumas, I don't know if you've looked at her work as well.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
And I feel where you let go and it becomes more expressive and less tight, less illustrative. It almost, there is that, there's a different sense of feeling than the tighter earlier work that you showed us. But I love seeing it all together, and the changing influences and you trying out different methods, I think is important, and different approaches. But certainly the figure within an environment seems to, for me, work better than the tighter, more focused figures or containment of vehicle, or I think you've worked really well with space and that ambiguity that you want. There is a kind of ethereal sense to it, an otherworldly feeling of it. They're the two that I really liked.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I am making some progress with giving more space, but I find every time I give more space, I find more things to put in it. But maybe that's not such a bad thing, and I'm sort of working more out on the canvas in the painting rather than meticulously planning it all in advance. And I think I've got to find a way through, you know, using photography and film as a springboard, as an inspiration, maybe, but not using it as a kind of strict recipe that I have to stick to, you know, or like a very rigid reference that I have to try and translate. interestingly, the painter that I mentioned at the end, who works with the home solarization, tilting the laptop screen, she doesn't describe herself as a painter or an artist. She describes herself as an image translator, which I find quite interesting. So, you know, I think especially coming from my classics background, a lot of my undergraduate years were spent translating from Latin and Greek to English. And you can never, I mean, you think image translator, you think, okay, she's copying the images, but a translator is never copying, because there's an idiom in the two things that you're translating from and to. So there's an idiom in the photography and there's an idiom in the painting. And in translating that, something really interesting and creative happens. And I think that is partly what fascinates me. I haven't yet worked out how to kind of, or whether to present the photographs that I make alongside the paintings, because I worry that the photographs will undermine the painting somehow. But I'm also sort of conscious that that process that I go through to come up with the paintings is quite important, conceptually. So that's just a little puzzle that I've got to work through. I mean, maybe all the photography just stays in the background. And
do you make anything between the photographs and the paintings on your surface then?
Yeah, I make sketches, but I do spend a lot of time playing around with photographs and re-photographing things, and just, you know, recently this last year, you know, putting them through apps like Glitch Lab to get different effects and kind of quoting from that. But actually with the more recent, kind of more expressive paintings, the photos have taken a back seat. And as I was saying, you know, more is actually going on the canvas itself and less in the run up to that point. Well, it's kind of a push and pull, you know. Sometimes I'm more influenced or more closely translating the photos, and sometimes I'm moving away from them and the photos are more like prompts to memory, especially if the photos are really bad.
I would think it would be quite fun to describe your process, but not include the photographic images that you're working from. It certainly adds a layer to hear about them, but I'm not sure that actually seeing the photograph that you'd come up with in the end would add anything if you were displaying your work.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, as I suppose I hinted there, that the photographs are awful photographs. You know, they're terrible, but they're inspiring as well. You know, they make me think about different ways of making marks.
I think W.G. Sebald in his books used to just take a perfectly normal photo, put it on the photocopier again and again until it developed its own kind of mystery, and then use it as an uncaptioned illustration in his books. But I found myself wanting to see the photos you were working from, but I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for you to satisfy as the artist.
Oh,
Keep
that's
some
really
mystery.
Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned Gerhard Richter and Luc Tuymans, and I can see their influence, but I think of their work as being really cold and kind of documentary, newspaper-like. They kind of remove, for me, the emotional experience And I think that's the difference between what their work does and what your work does. I can see your like a kind of a classical reading of pop culture in your work, and you're bringing in a more internal, like empathetic, emotional experience that really connects with me. And you're weaving in nature, like there's fire and water and spirit. And so it starts to feel like you're taking something ordinary like pop culture and you're making it kind of sacred. And I didn't have a preference. I mean, whether you went really specific and deliberate about your techniques with the light, or whether you were looser, I liked all of them, and I thought they all functioned in that way. Do you know Elizabeth Peyton?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah, she does that's kind of a similar thing where she makes portraits of famous people, and they feel like little idols, you know, and they're so precious and they have so much spirit.
Thank you. Oh, I hadn't thought of her work for a long time. Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the William Gibson, and it's funny because I had the quote from, I think it's the Neuromancer. The quote is, "The sky was the color of television," just kind of in my head as you were showing those images, and like when you mentioned psychosis as losing touch with reality, I thought it's interesting because the paintings previously, they were like the opposite. They were bringing reality from the unreal. So you've got this really transient image on the screen that's like flickering lines, but to capture that as an object in paint, it just seems like a really powerful thing to do. So it's quite an interesting sort of thing there, the use of the screen and the transient nature of digital images.
Thank you. Yeah, and I've been having a bit of a nightmare actually, trying to get an old cathode ray TV working again, and I've sort of basically I've got to the point where I can plug in my laptop through a variety of different cables and fiddly bits, and I can just about get an image, but it's not quite the same as it used to be. It makes you sound really old, but I used to love the cathode ray TV. Just the look of it, you know, it's just really grainy, but at the same time really smooth and
yeah,
like
there's
got
a certain flow.
Yeah, you don't get that glow, I don't think, from a digital screen. They're very flattened. The image is very flattened, and with digital, you get this blocky sort of look, a bit kind of Minecrafty, and I don't find that so appealing. It's not so kind of human. And the other thing about the cathode ray TV is, and I keep going on about the texture of it, but it's like canvas, isn't it? Because canvas is a weave, and the grid of lights is a kind of grid and a weave. You know, it's been sort of woven together, you know, vertical and horizontal, and a lot of my painting uses those vertical and horizontal lines to kind of articulate that feel, or to try to in paint.
That's interesting. There was a guy on my course who talked about like digital grain, and kind of as you're talking there, I think I sort of understand, you know, like in terms of analog versus digital, and kind of getting to the grain of it, and look at that sort of analog glow from old televisions and how that can sort of lend itself to paint probably more readily. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
I was also really interested in how you translated that analog but yet digital texture, because I also work from photographs a lot, but and often sort of analog photography, so sort of photographic film images. And if I've ever sort of photographed a screen or a laptop with a film on, or, you know, I'm often inspired by sort of footage I find. It's interesting because I like the kind of softness that are maybe a photographic image, an analog image would have. I try and avoid those sort of weaves and those textures, and it's just interesting that you use that you use that intentionally as your sort of your interest and your drive to sort of create images from that. And it just fascinated me to to think of that as something to find appealing in an image. So I really am grateful for that kind of different way of looking at kind of the qualities of image as well, to kind of become a material kind of inspiration. So thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the softness that you refer to, I think that's something that Toymans takes from it as well, and is very, you know, he sort of reduces the image down, but there's almost like a watercolor quality to it, a sort of blotchy quality, which I do like as well. But yeah, I mean, we all see things differently. Thanks.
Hi Lucy,
Hi.
I love the territory you started to talk about translation and how we translate one thing into another, and it's a very interesting space because there's a gap often in that process as we translate from one. If you're drawing something, for example, just even the space between the looking and going down to the piece of paper, there's this gap. And in that space, it's interesting to me. And in your painting The Last Light on the Quarry, I feel that you started to use mark making in that translation. You're obviously very obsessed with this moire, this screen. What happens with the screen is translating in the image. But I felt that in The Last Light on the Quarry, there's something about the mark making that's, you talked about how you'd really wanted to put different sorts of marks across a surface, you know, and I thought that is quite fascinating that you did another of Two Men in a Car where it was much more loose in your mark making. So I wondered whether that is something to explore as alongside this other more photographic idea of translation that you're interested in.
Yeah, definitely. And I haven't got images of them today, but I've definitely got 3 or 4 fairly large paintings in the studio that are at a very unsatisfactory stage. But in them, I suppose I am attempting that. You know, I'm trying to get a contrast between this very loose Doig inspired kind of indistinctness and then a tighter kind of attention to detail using the vertical lines on people's faces especially, and I think, but the tricky thing is knowing what to use where, what technique to use where. You know, I feel like I'm just every month pretty much I'm finding a new way of making marks or a new technique, and it's going to need some time for them all to sort of fall into place, but it's definitely an aspiration to kind of get them working together and working for each other rather than there being a sort of disjuncture between them. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for all the comments in the chat. That's really interesting. I'll have to read them in more detail. I guess the chat can be saved as well. Can that get saved? Yeah, great. Does anybody else have any more questions, or are we all good? Well, thanks very much for listening, everyone. It was really fascinating hearing your comments and feedback. Yeah, thank you to Jane as well for presenting, and thank you to Christina for hosting the Zoom, and thank you to Rachel for organising.
Yeah, thank you both for presenting. That was great. I think somebody has to save the chat. I don't know how.
Okay. Okay, I'll just have a quick read through now.
Where it's got the 3 dots next to the,
Go to the 3 dots in the
it
chat.
says save chat.
Okay. Oh yeah.
It will save it to your computer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I've got a Zoom folder. So yeah.
I've saved it.
Okay, should I stop recording?
Thank you so much. That was really enjoyed it. I find it hard to speak on the Zoom, but it was really brilliant. Two very completely different artists, but very, very well done and brilliant work. And I'm glad to be able to join in on these Zoom studio visits. It's brilliant.
Thank you, Emma.
And thank you, Rachel, again for organising these.